It was just this past November. I was feeling completely overwhelmed by my job in the city and desperately needed a few days of total silence to clear my head and catch up on some personal projects. I ended up finding a small, inexpensive cabin rental deep in the forested hills of northern Pennsylvania. The listing described it as a completely off-the-grid experience, nestled on acres of private land with no neighbors for miles. It sounded perfect. I packed my laptop, a week's worth of groceries, and headed out early on a Thursday morning. When I pulled up the long, unpaved driveway, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. It was simple, slightly weathered, and surrounded entirely by dense stands of tall pine trees. The air was crisp and biting, and the silence of the woods was immediately heavy. I spent the afternoon unpacking my things, setting up a small workspace by the front window, and building a fire in the old wood stove to take the chill out of the rooms. Around 4 in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, I decided to go for a short walk down the trail behind the cabin to stretch my legs. The woods were dead quiet, with only the sound of dry leaves crumbling beneath my boots. I walked for maybe 10 minutes before I suddenly got an unsettling feeling that I was being watched. I stopped in place and scanned the trees. About 100 yards out, near a decaying woodpile, I spotted a man. He didn't look like a hiker or a park ranger. He was wearing normal, dark street clothes and standing completely motionless, staring directly in the direction of the cabin. I felt a quick spike of discomfort, but I forced myself to raise my hand and wave to be polite. The man didn't wave back. He didn't shift his weight or break his stare at all. Instead, he slowly stepped sideways behind a thick cluster of pine trees and completely disappeared from view. I told myself he was probably just a local property owner or someone checking on timber, even though the rental listing claimed total isolation. I turned around and walked quickly back to the cabin, locking the heavy front door behind me. By 7 that evening, the winter storm that the weather app had warned about finally arrived at full force. Heavy winds began slamming relentlessly against the side of the structure, making the old wooden walls creak and groan. Snow started falling in a thick wall of white, completely blocking out any view past the windows. I left the shades open so I could watch the snow fall while I worked at my desk, trying to distract myself from the weird encounter earlier. Suddenly, there was a loud click from the wall, and the entire cabin plunged into absolute darkness. The power had cut out completely. The sudden blackout was jarring. Because of the storm clouds and the dense forest, there was zero ambient light coming from outside. I couldn't even see my own hands in front of my face. I sat perfectly still for a second, waiting for my eyes to adjust, but it stayed pitch black. I carefully stood up from my chair and began tracing my hand against the wall, blindly feeling my way toward the kitchen table, where I had left my flashlight. As I reached the kitchen, the howling wind outside unexpectedly died down for a brief moment, creating a profound, suffocating silence inside the cabin. And that is when I heard it, a very distinct, heavy crunch of snow right outside the kitchen window. Someone was walking slowly along the perimeter of the cabin. My heart began pounding violently against my chest. I froze in place, holding my breath so I wouldn't make a sound. The slow, deliberate footsteps continued around the side of the house, moving directly toward the back door. I heard the faint, metallic creak of the back doorknob being turned and pulled. I felt a wave of intense relief, knowing that I had secured the locks. But that relief was entirely short-lived. A second later, a soft scratching sound echoed from inside the house. It wasn't coming from the back door. It was coming from the small utility closet directly across the kitchen hallway. I stared intensely down the dark corridor as my eyes slowly finished adapting to the deep shadows. The utility closet door was on a sliding track. Slowly, with an agonizingly quiet scrape, the closet door began to slide open. A tall, dark figure leaned out from the pitch-black void of the closet. Even in the shadows, I could see his face clearly. It was the same man from the woods. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely locked on me with an empty, dead expression. He didn't look surprised that I was standing there awake. He looked entirely calm, almost as if he had been waiting for the exact moment the lights went out. Adrenaline flooded my body, breaking me out of my state of shock. I didn't think or hesitate. I blindly reached onto the table, grabbed my car keys, and bolted straight for the front door. Behind me, I heard the heavy, rapid thuds of his boots hitting the linoleum floor as he began sprinting up the hallway. I threw the front door open, slammed it closed behind me to buy a fraction of a second, and threw myself into the front seat of my truck. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely get the key into the ignition. The truck roared to life just as the cabin door flew open again. I threw the vehicle into reverse and tore down the snowy driveway, completely blind through the swirling blizzard, until I finally reached the safety of the main highway. I drove until I found a state trooper, parked at a gas station about 20 minutes away, and told them everything. 2 officers drove out to investigate the cabin while I waited. When they reported back, they told me the man was entirely gone. But inside the utility closet, they found clear evidence that someone had been living inside the walls for at least a week. There was a pile of trash, a sleeping bag, and several personal items that belonged to previous renters. The police treated it as a standard burglary, but there is one final detail that still gives me chills to this day. The following morning, when I went out to look at my truck in the daylight, I noticed deep, fresh scratches on the inside grip of the driver's side door handle. It looked as though someone had been repeatedly trying to pull the latch open from the outside while I was inside the cabin earlier that afternoon. It terrifies me to realize that the danger wasn't just waiting for me outside in the woods. He had already been watching me, tracking my movements, and standing just inches away from me in the dark the entire time. This happened a few years back when I was 23. I had been working entirely too hard and was desperate for a stress-free, isolated vacation to completely unplug. It was early winter, about 2 weeks after Christmas, which is the absolute dead-off season for mountain rentals, so I managed to score an incredible deal on a remote timber cabin deep in the woods. When I first arrived, the absolute lack of sound was jarring. If you haven't been entirely alone in an isolated forest in winter, the profound silence plays tricks on your mind. It starts out peaceful, but it quickly transforms into a heavy, persistent reminder of exactly how vulnerable you are out there. The first night went by perfectly fine. I spent the evening reading by the warmth of the fireplace, made a quiet dinner, and fell asleep with 0 issues. I woke up the next morning feeling refreshed, but by mid-afternoon, the isolation was starting to make me a little restless. While looking around the living room, I noticed the owner had framed a rough, hand-drawn map next to the front door. It outlined a simple, 2-mile walking path that looped through the forest directly behind the property. Figuring it would pass the time, I bundled into my jacket and headed out. It became clear within minutes that this path wasn't well maintained. The brush was overgrown, and the trail was incredibly difficult to track beneath the winter debris. But halfway through the loop, I stumbled upon a clear, distinct path splitting off from the main trail, one that wasn't marked on the owner's map at all. Driven by pure curiosity, I decided to check it out. I pushed through a dense, freezing thicket of briars, and that's when I saw it. Tucked into a small, shadowed hollow was a second cabin. This place was completely ruined. The timber siding was rotting, thick green moss crawled up the structure, and the roof had partially collapsed under the weight of old storms. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. It was easily the creepiest-looking structure I had ever seen, and knowing it was sitting just a short walk from my rental made my stomach drop. I approached cautiously. The front door was completely missing, leaving a dark, gaping entry. I stepped up to the threshold and peered into the interior, which smelled overwhelmingly of mildew and decaying wood. Dust covered every single surface inside, except for one spot. Right across the center of the rotting floorboards was a clean, distinct line of fresh footprints scuffed into the dust. Someone had been inside this ruin very recently. As I stood there staring at the prints, trying to rationalize who could have made them, something shifted in the corner of my eye. At the far side of the room was a narrow doorway leading into a back room, a space completely devoid of windows and filled with an absolute ink-black darkness. I was entirely certain I saw a physical shape move within that dark void. I didn't investigate. I turned on my heel and moved quickly back down the path, not stopping until I was safely inside my rental with the deadbolt thrown shut. Once my adrenaline settled, I tried to convince myself it was just another curious renter who had found the place before me. Seeking confirmation, I pulled out my phone and texted the cabin owner, asking about the old abandoned structure I found on the back trail. An hour passed before my phone finally buzzed. The owner's response was a single, flat sentence. "There are no other cabins anywhere on that land." I stared at the screen, completely frozen. He was either outright lying to me, or he genuinely had no idea what was occupying the woods just a few hundred yards from his property. The gaslighting of that text message made the air in the room feel instantly colder. If you're feeling the chilling dread of this isolation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our true horror breakdowns. Now, back to the story. By 11 that evening, the uneasy paranoia had completely taken over. The woods outside were dead quiet. There was no wind, no animal calls. Even the trees stood perfectly rigid and motionless in the dark. I sat perfectly still on the couch, watching the dark entrance of the trail through the main window. And then, I heard it. A sharp, distinct snap of a branch right outside the cabin. Someone was walking along the perimeter of the house. I moved silently across the room, tracking the faint thumps as they transitioned from the frozen ground onto the wooden floorboards of the front porch. The heavy footsteps walked directly up to the front door, and then everything went completely silent. 30 seconds of agonizing quiet passed. I was trapped inside with no car, and whoever was standing on the other side of that thin wooden door was just inches away from me. Desperate to find out who it was without opening the door, I pulled out my phone and texted the owner again. "Someone is standing on the porch right now. Is this you? Did you come down here?" The exact second I hit send, a loud electronic text chime rang out from the dark porch outside. My heart aggressively spiked into my throat. The person standing outside the door wasn't a random drifter. It was the owner. But why was he standing out there in the freezing dark? Why hadn't he texted me back? And why wasn't he knocking? Terrified, I immediately dialed 911. I whispered my emergency to the operator, my eyes locked entirely on the brass doorknob, knowing with absolute certainty that the owner possessed a master key to the cabin and could walk in whenever he pleased. But he didn't. For the next 20 minutes, I stood frozen in the center of the room, listening to the muffled thumps of him pacing back and forth on the porch, seemingly debating whether or not to use his key. Finally, the distant glare of flashing blue lights cut through the trees. I heard him jump off the porch and sprint into the darkness, just before the police pulled into the driveway. I gave the responding officers the entire timeline and showed them the text messages on my phone. They immediately dispatched a unit to the owner's primary address in town, but his house was completely dark. He didn't answer his door, and he refused to pick up his phone. It took the authorities several days to finally force him into an interview room, and even then, he denied everything. He claimed he was asleep in town the entire night, and that his phone must have been cloned or hacked. Because the snow had drifted and covered the footprints on the porch, and without any definitive physical evidence linking him to the scene, the police ultimately couldn't file formal charges. I packed my bags and left that mountain the second the sun came up, completely abandoning the rest of my rental reservation. I still have no idea what his true intentions were that night, or what he was hiding in that ruined cabin in the woods. but a dark part of me knows how close I came to never leaving that forest alive. Before we dive into our final story, if you love these bone-chilling accounts of grounded realism, make sure to drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel for more raw horror content. Now, let us begin. This happened back in the summer of 2018. I lived in what you would call your typical cabin in the woods. It was situated about a half hour outside of a small town, completely surrounded by dense forest. It was a comfortable, quiet place, and it was so far out of the way that in the 8 years I had lived there prior to this night, I had never once seen or even heard another person anywhere near my property. It was a Tuesday morning when I decided to go for a casual walk around my land. I knew the acreage well enough to not need a trail or any markers, so I was just hiking through the thick trees and enjoying the wilderness when I stumbled on something that immediately felt wrong. Just 300 feet from the back of my cabin, I found the unmistakable remnants of a fresh campsite. There was a burnt-out pile of ashes from a campfire and a flat, cleared area where a tent had clearly been set up. As I stood directly in the center of the campsite, I looked up and realized I could see my back porch clear as day through the trees. That is how incredibly close it was. Whoever had been staying there could not possibly have mistaken this for private land. It felt entirely intentional, like they meant to be right on top of my house. I walked around the area for a bit longer, looking for any other signs or footprints, but I came up completely empty-handed. It was just that one single spot. It made me deeply uneasy to realize I had no idea how long they had been out there, or how I had never noticed them before. I suppose after spending so many years in absolute isolation, I had simply stopped thinking to look around my own property. The next few days passed completely normally, and I slowly started to let the anxiety fade. But everything changed on Saturday night. I had decided to sit out on my back porch with a few drinks to enjoy the calm forest breeze when I caught a sudden flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked deeper into the grid of trees and saw an orange glow flickering in the darkness. It was coming from the exact same spot as the old campsite, and by the warm color and the way the shadows danced against the pine needles, I was 100% sure it was a fresh campfire. Against my better judgment, I stood up and started walking out into the woods to confront them. I intended to be entirely polite about it. I was just going to tell whoever was out there that this was private property, and I was even thinking of letting them finish out the night just to keep the interaction friendly and avoid any unnecessary conflict. In my haste, I made the terrible mistake of not grabbing a flashlight first. As I stepped deeper into the tree line, the darkness swallowed me completely, and I could barely see the ground beneath my feet, aside from the distant glow of the fire. When I finally reached the clearing of the campsite, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The site was completely empty. No one was there. There was just a fire burning fiercely in the middle of the trees, and a small nylon tent pitched right next to it. The logs were fresh, meaning someone had to have been standing there just seconds before I arrived. The horrifying realization hit me that this person was likely watching my cabin, saw me walking over, and intentionally left the fire burning to hide in the shadows. I started looking around the trees frantically, but everything between the thick trunks was filled with shifting black shadows. The air felt suffocatingly tense, and a wave of pure panic crashed over me. I turned around and began hurrying back toward my cabin as fast as I could. I just wanted to get inside, grab my phone, and call the police. But as I broke through the tree line and stopped right in the middle of the open field between the woods and my house, I froze completely. My front door was standing wide open. The sheer horror of the situation paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. I had been completely tricked and lured out of my own home. Standing there in the middle of the dark field, I realized I had nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Every single light inside the cabin had been turned off, leaving the structure entirely dark. I crept slowly up to the threshold of the open front door, my heart beating so loudly I was certain it would give me away. Every single sense in my body was spiked with adrenaline. I peered into the black void of the house and called out into the dark, asking who was in there. I waited several agonizing seconds for a response, but the silence inside was absolute. I took 2 cautious steps into the hallway. I knew I needed either my phone or my car keys to escape, but my phone was all the way on the other side of the cabin in my bedroom. My car keys were much closer, sitting right on the end table near the kitchen layout. I built up every ounce of courage I had and quickly moved over to grab the keys. But just as my fingers brushed against the metal keychain, I looked up. There, hidden in the pitch-black, shadowy corner of the kitchen, was a tall figure standing perfectly still, watching me. I bolted back toward the front door as fast as my legs could carry me, instantly hearing the heavy, rapid thuds of his boots sprinting out of the kitchen right behind me. I slammed the front door shut to buy myself a microsecond of time, rushed down the porch steps, and threw myself into my car. The man did not let up for a single second. He burst through the front door and was sprinting across the gravel driveway, just as I turned the ignition and the engine roared to life. I slammed the car into reverse to do a frantic 3-point turn, but he caught up to the vehicle instantly. He grabbed the passenger door handle and managed to pull it open slightly before I slammed my foot on the accelerator and pulled away, breaking his grip by mere milliseconds. I drove dangerously fast, all the way to the local police station in town. The entire drive, my hands were shaking uncontrollably on the steering wheel as I thought about how close that encounter had been. While I waited at the station, the anxiety was unbearable, until one of the responding officers finally reported back from the property. The intruder had attempted to burn my cabin to the ground. They found the fireplace raging out of control, intentionally loaded with a mountain of wood that had begun to spill structural fire directly into the living room floorboards. It was an absolute miracle the entire house had not caught flame immediately, and the officers were able to tame the blaze just long enough for the fire department to arrive and smother it completely. The only physical evidence left behind by the man was the ash from his campsite. Everything else, including his tent and the man himself, had vanished back into the wilderness without a trace. The crime investigation dragged on for months, but without any concrete leads or security footage, the case ultimately fizzled out to nothing. I never spent a single night in that cabin ever again, choosing instead to hire professional movers to pack my life away while I stayed far away in the city. I will never know what that man truly had planned for me, or how long he had been stalking my home from the shadows of those woods, but I know I am incredibly lucky to have made it out of that field alive.